The line becomes a river, page 54. When the call came out on the road, I braced myself for the smell. That's the worst part, the senior agents would always say, the smell. During my first week at the station, one of them suggested I carry a small tin of Vicks Vapor Rub with me wherever I went. If you came upon a dead body, he said, rub that shit under your nose, or else the smell would stay with you for days. I arrived at the scene in the still hot hours of the early evening. Hart had already been with the body for 30 minutes. It's fresh, he told me, maybe 2 hours old. It doesn't smell yet. Hart had been flagged down by 2 teenagers as he was driving across the reservation. They put rocks in the road, he said, gesturing awkwardly towards the boys. He stood with his hands in his pockets and then asked me if I would talk to them. They kept asking me questions, he said. I can't understand them. One of the boys was sitting on a rock, looking disoriented. I went over to him and asked how he knew the dead man. Es mi tío, he told me. He stared at his hands as he spoke. How old are you? I asked. 17. He looked at his friend. I looked at his friend, standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. And you? He looked from the ground. 19, he said. The dead man and the 2 boys all hailed from the same village in Veracruz, and had set out together on the journey north. The 19-year-old did most of the talking, telling me that a few hours before the man died, he had taken suicide pills, caffeine uppers that the border crossers often take for energy, and had washed them down with a homemade sugarcane liquor they had brought with them from Veracruz. A few hours later, he said, the old man was staggering around like a drunk, and then he collapsed. I walked over to the body. Hart had placed a shirt over the dead man's face. I lifted it and looked at him. His eyes were closed and had long dark hair that utterly looked like a dead man. White foam had bubbled up and collected between his parting lips, and his face was covered in small red ants traveling in neat lines towards the moisture. His shirt was pulled up at the sides of his abdomen, and I could see where the skin was turning purple with dependent lividity as his blood settled to the ground. With the toe of my boot, I gently moved his arm, already stiff with rigor mortis. The 19-year-old told me that the 3 of them had become separated from their group. The guide had told them to spread out, to hide in the bushes by the road and wait for the load vehicles. They must have gone too far, he said, because sometime later they heard a car stop and then drive off. And after that they couldn't find anyone. Alone, at the edge of the road, they walked for several miles in the August heat until the dead man finally laid down to die. The boys waited beside the road to flag down one of the infrequently passing cars, but no one stopped for them. That's why they put rocks out, they said, to make the cars stop. The boys asked me what would happen to the dead man if they could come with the body to the hospital. I told them they could not, and that they had to stay with us. They would be processed for deportation, and that the body would be turned over to the tribal police. They asked if the body would come back to Mexico with them, if they could bring it back to their village. I told them they can't. The body would be taken to the county medical examiner, who tried to determine the cause of death. I told the boys they would be taken to the sector headquarters, where they would meet with the Mexican consul, that it was the consul who would make the arrangements for the reparation of the body in Mexico. As I spoke, the man's nephew stared at the ground. Maybe the consul can provide you with some documentation, I suggested, something to take home to their family. The boys didn't want to leave, and even as I explained the procedures to them, I began to doubt, given what I knew from my short time on the border, whether they would actually see a consul, whether the consulate would actually arrange for the body to go back to Mexico, whether the boys would receive a piece of paper to help explain the death to the dead man's family who had befallen him on the journey north. As I spoke to them, Hart came over with and instructed the boys to take off their belts and shoelaces and any watches, necklaces, or other jewelry they might have, and to take from their pockets any lighters, pens, knives, or other sharp objects. I looked to Hart. Transport is coming, he said. Another agent, junior even to Hart and me, arrived to transport the boys back to the station. He brought a camera to photograph the body, and he took his pictures. and as he took his pictures, I noticed the dead man's nephew watching in a sort of trance. I explained to the boy that the pictures were required by the police, that they were needed for the reports we had to file at the station. He just nodded his head, as if he had heard and understood nothing. Like he knew it was what he was supposed to do. Before the boys were loaded into the transport unit, I went to them and told them that I was sorry for their loss. It's a hard thing, I said. I told them that if they ever decided to cross again, they must not cross in summer. It's too hot, I said. To cross in this heat is to risk one's life. I told them to never take pills the coyotes gave them, because they suck the moisture from the body. I told them that many people die there, that in the summer people die every day, year after year, and many more were found hovering at the edge of death. The boys thanked me, I think, and were placed into the transport unit and driven away. The sun had already begun to set as I left the body, and it cast a warm light in the sun clouds gathering in the south. As I drove toward the storm, the desert and the sky above it grew dark with the setting sun and the coming rain. When the first drops hit my windshield, I could hear the dispatch radio to Hart, who had stayed behind with the body, that the tribal police didn't have any officers available, and that he'd have to wait with the dead man a while longer. Later that night, at the end of our shift, I saw Hart back at the station and asked him what happened with the body. He told me that finally when the storm had come, and the dispatch had told him to just leave the body there because the tribal police wouldn't have an officer to take charge of it until the next day. It's all right, he told me. They have the coordinates. I asked him if it had been strange waiting there in the dark, watching over the body of a dead man. Not really, he said. At least he didn't smell it yet. We stood for a few more minutes talking about the storm and the human body that lay there in the desert, and the dark and the rain, and we talked of the animals that might come in the night and of the humidity and the deadly heat that would come in the morning. We talked, and then we went home. I dreamt in the night that I am grinding my teeth out, splitting the crumbling pieces into my palms and holding them into my cupped hands, searching for someone to show them to, someone who could see what is happening. The various men called upon to survey the nascent border between the United States and Mexico in the following years of the ratification of the treaties of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, could not help but to comment on the strangeness of their task and the extreme unfamiliar nature in the landscape. In places, commission reports remarked upon the arbitrary chosen nature of the boundary line and the impractical nature of their work. Survey members noted, indeed, much of this country that by those residing at a distance and is imaged to a perfect paradise is a sterile waste, utterly worthless of any purpose other than to constitute a barrier or a natural line of democratization between the two neighboring nations. After the Gaddesam purchase, Lieutenant Nathaniel Mitchell observed to Commissioner William H. Emery that imagination cannot picture a more dreary, sterile country. The burnt lime-like appearance of the soil is ever before you. The very stones look like a scourge of furnace. There is no grass, but a sticky vegetation, more unpleasant to the sight than the barren earth itself. Excuse me. More than 30 years after the original survey, subsequent surveyors found that the lands adjacent to the border remained thinly settled and noted the prevalence of thorns in nearly all vegetation and general absence of fragrance and flowers, the resinous characters of the odor of the most common trees and shrubs. Giant cactus were described as strangely, ungiantly, helpless-looking objects with clumsy arms. In places, the borderlands were beautiful beyond description, with mountains rising out of the plains like islands from the sea, but everywhere else the landscape was a hopeless desert, a place of loneliness and desolation. The field party that deported from El Paso in February of 1892 to begin the work of the resurveying and remarking of the boundary was a massive force numbering about 60, which included several commissioners, engineers, and astronomers, as well as a secretary, a field clerk, a wagon master, a blacksmith, a quartermaster, a carpenter, a medical officer, a recorder, a photographer, a topographer, a draftsman, a levelman, and multiple transit men, roadmen, targetmen, teamsters, packers, cooks, and other helpers. To carry their supplies, the group traveled with 83 mules and 14 saddle ponies. The expedition was further provided by the U.S. War Department, with a military escort of 20 insulated cavalrymen and a detachment of 30 infantrymen, as a protection against the Indians and other marauders. The opening days of the expedition, men and animals were new and unseasoned to hardship, but in a few days the majority became accustomed to field life, and this work soon progressed rapidly and satisfactorily. To reform the coastline, latitude was determined by the astronomers and their assistants using the telecot method, or through an exchange of signals by telegraph over the course of 10 nights in which the same stars were observed from distant stations. The men also used chronometers, bullseye lanterns, steel tape, and a besosphere, a zenithscope, telescope mounted on a brick pier, a sextant mounted on a wooden pier, and a froth-repeating theodolite, furnished on the horizon motions with the axis clamps and tangent screws working against the spiral springs. As the surveying party moved across the boundary, contingents of men were continually conveyed and reconfigured and sent by rail or caravan to initiate duties along distinct sections of the line. These contingents often worked out of new settlements along the border, and the Commission's report noted the grasping and overreaching action of the United States settlers, and the kindness and courtesy of the Mexican officials. In some of the areas, the newly annexed terrain was so remote and unknown as the necessity of the dispatching of reconnaissance parties to secure reliable information concerning water, roads, and general topographical features of the country. The surveyors described the land as bare and ragged, desolate through and rough, punctured by rocky hills and steep, narrow ridges of mountains of stratified limestone and porphyry, red basalt, and igneous rock thrusted upward alongside empty craters and extinct volcanoes surrounded by broken lava. As they traversed through the farthest flung corners of the desert, the surveying parties passed the gravesites of travelers who had perished before them. In a single day's ride, the commissioners reported 65 of these graves were counted by the roadside, one containing an entire family whose horses had given out, and who, unable to cross the scorching desert on foot, all perished together of thirst. Their bodies were found by some travelers during the following rainy seasons, and were buried in one grave, which is covered with a cross of stones. As they cautiously made their way along the infamous Camino de Diablo, the reports noted that during the few years that this road was much traveled in the rush of California of 1850s and 1860s, over 400 persons were said to have perished of thirst, a recorded probability without parallel in North America. The surveyors who made it clear that supplying the working parties with water on the deserts was a problem of the survey, in comparison with which all other obstacles sank into insignificance. The commissioner's final report revealed that the terrestrial portion of the line, although having a total length of about 700 miles, crosses but 5 permanent running streams between the Rio Grande and the Pacific. The report took special care in describing the point in which the boundary line gave itself over to the Rio Grande, a variable stream with turbid waters. The river carried an immense amount of sediment, it noted, and as consequence, as it is bordered by alluvial bottoms, thought through which by erosion is continuously changing its bed. It was as if the surveyors wished to acknowledge how the border, no matter how painstakingly fixed upon the land, could go on endlessly to change its course without the whimsy of a river. Excuse me. Walking to my truck at the end of my shift, I saw Mortison standing outside the armory with a group of agents. I went up the hill to listen to the agent named Beach, told the other men about his time as a prison guard. There was one guy, Beach said. We couldn't keep the bastard from cutting himself. Swear to God, all he thought about all day was how to slash through his own skin. There was hardly a thing he wouldn't find a way to cut himself with. I'm talking pencils, pieces of plastic, chunks of cardboard, you name it. Shit, and even magazines. I came into a cell one day, and his forearms were covered with paper cuts and thousands of little blood droplets, and this guy just stared up at me like a fucking deer in headlights. That's fucked up, muttered Morrison. Hell, said Beach. It's nothing. That same motherfucker, one day I get called into a cell and he's just sitting there with his crotch all covered in blood. Dude had sliced his cock up with a filed-down plastic spoon. I shit you not. With a filed-down plastic spoon, sorry. I shit you not. The other agents yelled out, and one of them threw an empty can of Monster at Beach's feet. For Christ's sakes, one cried, holding his stomach. Beach laughed. Shit, he said. How do you think I felt? You should have heard me call that one in to the nurse. An older agent named Navarro shook his head and grabbed his gun belt, hoisting it a little higher under his sagging belly. Some people are just like that, he said. Les vel madre. A few other agents nodded. I was in Iraq with this crazy white kid, Navarro told the group. He had one of those cock piercings. The agents winced. The other guy in the unit was always giving him shit because he was into heavy metal and freaky as hell. We started calling him Marilyn Manson, Mortison chuckled, and Navarro glanced at him. It gets worse, Vato. This kid was always looking at these fucked up magazines, pornos with tattoos, piercings and shit, and one day he showed me a picture of a cockhead split right down the middle, like a forked snake's tongue. I shit you not, the kid looked at me with a straight face and told me this was on his next to-do list. The agents burst out into a chorus of groans, and the same agent who had thrown the can of Monster called out to Navarro over jeers. Did he show it to you, or what? The other agents laughed. Navarro pulled up his belt again and shook his head. Kid never got the chance, Navarro replied. A week later, he got blown up, Vato. Just like that. Saw it with my own eyes. The other agents became quiet, and several of them looked down at the ground in awkward shame, but Beach remained with his head held up, glancing at Navarro to share a brief nod as if in acknowledgement.